All right, welcome to anybody who's watching. We are going to get started with chapter 14. No, don't want to draw. Sorry about that. All right, chapter 14. The knowledge objectives you can skim through on your own if you feel the need. That's a pretty long list, and we're going to cover it all by proxy as we go through these slides. So some of the homework that somebody who's tasked with the incident safety officer role at a hazmat incident may need to do. This is on the federal regulation side. Some of these we've covered already, some of them may be new. But if you go back to some of the things we talked about in Chapter 3, OSHA 1910 is the general industry standard, and that's usually where we fall if we are reported, or rather to required for compliance on the public safety side. So some of this is a slam dunk. 1910 120, that's going to be your HAZWOPER standard. That's where we find a lot of hazmat information, respiratory protection, bloodborne pathogens. We see those spread throughout our job for the most part. Some of the unique ones, the permit required confined space standard, we will revisit that a little bit more on the rescue chapter, chapter 15. And then hazard communication, the HAZCOM standard is usually on the employer to be able to communicate hazards to the employees that work at a fixed facility or a specific area. With that being said, we know the hazards associated with our job. That standard kind of comes in on the back end for anybody that we may be responding to. The incident safety officer has a barrage of standards that they need to be aware of, NFPA 472 being one of those. If you look at the standard for competence for responders to hazmat and weapons of mass destruction incidents, there's also another NFPA standard that we may cross the bridge with later, but this is where that awareness ops and tech level and even command level training for some of the latest revisions comes from. This is going to be outside of a standard of 1072, which is the individual competencies, what people are required to perform to get certified to on the hazmat side. So 472 is going to be essentially how you operate at these incidents. What's an awareness level, what's an operations level, technician, and so on, what level the interventions are. You've heard of defensive and offensive mitigation steps, so this is where that comes from. Long story short, we'll revisit this again later, but if the incident commander does not have the training that is required for the mitigation of the incident, such as technician level training, they would have to appoint an assistant safety officer, and in this realm, it would be an ASO HM for hazmat. We'll talk about it more in the rescue side, but on that end of the house, it would be an ASO RT for rescue tech if we were to need one of those. So according to OSHA and NFPA, if you do not have the level of training that is required for the intervention of the incident, you will need to appoint an ASO who does, and they can work directly under you as the IC. Some general functions for the ISO at hazmat incidents. Obviously, we want to assist with the establishment of all those hazard control zones, hot, warm, and cold zones. We want to monitor the effectiveness, make sure nobody's getting exposed, and if we do, we want to isolate those areas. And if any of that raises a tactical and strategic level concern,
Go ahead.
we would want to handle that in a appropriate manner. We don't want to raise 9 kinds of hell if we don't have to. Just handle that respectfully. If tactics and strategy start clashing on the safety side, just handle that as best you can with the incident commander. Continuing on into the actual operations. So we want to confirm that all of those responders are appropriately zoned and isolated for that hazard. What does that mean? We want to make sure that decon has been set up in the warm zone. We want to make sure that nobody's going through there into the cold zone that hasn't been decontaminated. We want to make sure the hot zone is appropriately set for the hazards that we're facing. A lot of that comes from your ASO HM if you've appointed one, but we are going to talk about the importance of a technical reference specialist also. It's important for us to have a reliable source for information for this stuff, and that usually comes from your technical reference specialist. So what can that person do? What can your tech ref specialist do for you? They can define that principal hazard, take a look at environmental integrity, which is something we're going to talk about in just a minute. The effects of the surrounding elements, that could be weather, that could be the terrain, and that also spills into the exposure threats to the responders. That could also fall under weather, that could also fall under terrain, and then some of the topics or the ingredients rather for the formula for risk taking here. So we talk about the chemical properties, whether it's flammable, whether it's toxic, whether it's both, whether it's corrosive. Then we look at the integrity of the container if it's contained. We look at the integrity of the environment if it's not contained and it's posing environmental hazards. And there's several other hazards such as routes of exposure, and some of the hazards can be brought forth just with our mitigation attempts also. So all that comes together to help us look at resource effectiveness. Is what we have on scene going to be effective to help us out? And then we use all that to kind of go together and figure out what kind of risk we are going to take. Is there life at stake? All that comes together to help us with that formula. Chemical properties, there's a list here. We'll talk about them very, very shortly. This is still the responsibility of the ISO or whoever you have brought in as your ASO. But detonation, obviously, that's going to be more alongside a weapon of mass destruction or even something flammable that you have a highly susceptible ignition source. Ground leaching, that's going to be from a spill, obviously. Gas plume spread is going to be a big one for us. That's one that may be visible, it may not be to the ISO or whoever's helping them out. So we would want to deploy some type of air monitoring, some type of atmospheric monitoring for that. Liquid flow, obviously going to be very, very difficult to contain early in the incident, but we do want to keep an eye on it to make sure that our crews, our equipment, and even members of the public aren't downstream of that or downwind, depending on what's going on, to protect them as best you can. Any health hazards, acute or chronic, want to be addressed as soon as possible. And whenever we talk about it being associated with the exposure to the chemical, we want to try to eliminate that exposure altogether. We can do that several ways. If you go back to some of the things we discussed earlier in the class with your risk-taking models, your risk management models, especially places that you can avoid the hazard. If you can't avoid the hazard, can you substitute a process for the exposure? If you can't substitute a process for the exposure, obviously we would be going the PPE route, and we want to take that PPE and its decon very, very seriously at that point. Environmental integrity, we kind of talked about this as a hazard earlier. Weather being a big one, whether rain's coming, what the wind is doing, humidity levels, even for certain types of chemicals. As far as infrastructure stability, it kind of goes hand in hand with the container condition. If it's in a building, is the structure stable? As far as what's around, traffic or something like that, we would want to stabilize the infrastructure around. Not that we're going to be the ones shoring up roads or anything to that effect, but if there are hazards that are created by the infrastructure surrounding, such as building, cars, any commerce, we would want to shut that down. Container condition, I think that kind of speaks for itself, folks. If you have a container that's leaking, it's probably the reason that you're there to begin with. If it's failing, you may want to take that into consideration at the task or even tactical level on how crews are going to be attacking this incident for mitigation. Hazardous energy is going to be a big one. That could be any utility source. It could be electric, it could be pneumatic, it could be gas powered with a combustion engine. Any of that that's in the area that is not helping support the mitigation effort, we want to take that hazardous energy isolation very, very seriously. And in fact, it even has its own OSHA standard. So let's always watch out for that hazardous energy, because that could be the difference in ignition. That could be the cause for one of your issues. If it's a pump that's pumping a hazardous chemical out of something and you kill the power to it, that may start solving some of your problems. Other hazards, obviously going to be the physical location of that hazmat. Can you access it? We talked about the importance of public roadway exposure and fixed facility just a few minutes ago. But one thing that boils down to how the ISO would approach this is you have to help that incident commander or even silently monitor resource effectiveness in the background. If what you're doing to mitigate these incidents is not working, it may be worth bringing up that we have a strategic or tactical shift. How do we get more resource to that scene? Your ASO HM may be able to help with some of those unknown resources also. And the reason I say that is because we look down and we see many fire departments use interagency agreements to assemble enough resources. We have that in our local area for sure with different fire departments and other law enforcement agencies that respond to some of these incidents. Staffing specialized equipment, SCBA management doesn't quite look the same on hazmat incidents. Air management in particular doesn't quite look the same on these incidents as it does for a structure fire. And then your decontamination process may take a little bit longer than expected depending on what that chemical is or what the exposure is. Lastly, task application. These are some of the things that would differ from one of our conventional incidents. I would say structure fire where we're using PPE and SCBA. Make sure before you commit to the task that you have the proper tools. And you can see some of the variables here on the screen. I'm not going to read it word for word, but whatever it is that these crews decide that they're going to use, we want to make sure that it's going to be effective. We want to make sure these people are trained on how to use that equipment. If you go back to the operational safety triad from either chapter 2 or 3 from way back, it's your people, it's your training, and it's your equipment. We want to make sure that all those are working together to assist with the mitigation of this incident. Team versus task, level of PPE, all of this is going to come from your technical reference specialist, the input that they give, specifically the PPE, and your HAZRIT. So we don't hear this term very, very commonly in the blue card world, but whenever you talk about rapid withdrawal options and you try to drag somebody out of the hot zone, you want to have somebody who is equally protected, if not greater protected from that hazard, because it could be a compromise that led us to this situation to begin with. So whoever your rapid intervention team or rapid intervention crew is for these folks that are working in the hot zone, we want to make sure that they are on standby, have a solid understanding of the mitigation that was supposed to take place. They know as much or more about this chemical than the folks that were in the hot zone to begin with, because knowledge is essentially power there.